This week's reading, it ended with the portion of tzitzis, that if you have a four-cornered garment, you must put fringes, which are called tzitzis, on the corners. And on the Torah level, nobody argues. When the Torah speaks about a garment, in Hebrew, the word garment is beged. It's either made of wool or linen. If it's made of any other fiber, cotton, whatever, any fiber, it's questionable. That's called a garment. So therefore, halachically, it's questionable that if you have a cotton garment, four-corner garment, whether putting tzitzis on that garment is rabbinical or it's a Torah obligation. It's a question. It's a question how to rule. So therefore, the Chofetz Chaim explains that if a person is able to wear a woolen garment, four-corner garment, it's best because a four-cornered woolen garment, nobody argues, the obligation definitely is a Torah obligation. So if you want to fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis, putting fringes on a four-corner garment on the Torah level, which is a much more advanced level of accomplishment, you should wear a woolen four-corner garment rather than cotton. That's the suggestion of the Chofetz Chaim in his work, Mishnah Berurah. But it's discussed, the last portion of this past week's reading discusses the mitzvah of tzitzis. And it's the last paragraph, is the closing paragraph of the Shema. The closing paragraph of the Shema is tzitzis, but what relevance is that? Why do we say it? Because contained in that paragraph, we mention God taking us out of Egypt. And since a Jew has an obligation twice a day to mention that God took us out of Egypt, it's a positive commandment. So therefore, they juxtapose the third paragraph to the Shema, to the first two paragraphs, which we'll discuss exactly what each one has its unique content and its relevance, the third paragraph in relevance to that. That's the reason why we say the third paragraph. But the third paragraph is the paragraph of tzitzis. So we read in tzitzis, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, should speak to the sons of Israel, sons of Israel, V'amarta aleim, and you should say to them, Voslem tzitzis, al kantei bigdem l'dorosam. They should make tzitzis fringes on the corners of the garments for all generations, meaning there's certain commandments which only if you're in Israel are you obligated to keep those commandments. Outside of Israel has no relevance. But there are many mitzvahs which are incumbent on the person, it's unrelated to his location. The Shema, eating kosher, eating in a sukkah, taking the four species, eating matzah, it's unrelated to being in Israel or wherever you are. If you're a Jew, an adult, you have an obligation to fulfill these positive commandments. But what about the ability to bring a sacrifice? You can only do that in Israel. Tithing your grain and your crops. Produce is only produce that grows in Israel. Produce that grows anywhere else, there's no basis to tithe it. So even if one goes through the motions of tithing, it has no value whatsoever. It has no consequence. In Israel, it has value, it has a consequence. Of course, what you tithe takes on a certain level of classification, whether it's only permitted to the Kohen once the tithing takes place, or it's given to the Levi. It's his financial portion. You must give it to the Levi. You must give it to the poor. You must take it to Yerushalayim to eat. You're only permitted to eat it because it's sanctity in Yerushalayim. But there are other mitzvahs, such as tzitzis. Wherever you are, you have a four-cornered garment. You must put fringes on the four corners. Tzitzis akanti bigdem dorosa for all generations. V'nosnu al tzitzis hakonov psil tchelis. We know that even though we don't have tchelis, what's tchelis? Tchelis is a certain type of dye that we dye some of the strings of the tzitzis, and that just brings it to another level. It's a more enhanced mitzvah. In the Talmud refers to tzitzis as lovon. Love means white strings. Tcheles is a question among the commentators. Was it blue? Was it green? It's a question. But what was the basis for the dye, what was its origin? So the Gemara explains us that there's a certain snail that comes out of the ocean once every 70 years. And that snail is called chalazon. Chalazon, like you go to a pizza shop, they sell calzone, but this is a different word. It's chalazon. Chalazon is the snail, and its blood has this specific color. And the Torah says you must take its blood of the snail and you dye some of the strings with this dye. And when you apply that dye to the tzitzis, it brings the mitzvah to a more complete level. And the Talmud discusses why this color, which is a separate discussion right now, because I'm not at this moment here to discuss the obligation of tzitzis, why it's this way. Now, there is no obligation to wear tzitzis. No obligation whatsoever. If you wear a four-cornered garment, you must put tzitzis on a four-cornered garment. But it doesn't say anywhere that you have an obligation to wear a four-cornered garment. But if you want to bring yourself into the obligation, I'll give you an example. A person has a financial opportunity. And if he puts money, the return is phenomenal. You have no obligation to put money. But if you're smart and you understand that it's almost a guaranteed return, you put money there. There's no obligation to wear a four-cornered garment. But we'll see in a moment, the value of the mitzvah of wearing tzitzis is the equivalent of all 613 mitzvahs. That's its innate value. So only if you wear the four-cornered garment, you must put fringes, which is a positive commandment. But there's no obligation to wear the four-cornered garment. Only if you wear the four-cornered garment, you must put tzitzis on the fringes on its corners. Meaning, and if you do, what's its value? It has phenomenal value. So let's say a Jew, for whatever reason, chooses not to wear tzitzis. And why? Because he doesn't wear the four-cornered garment. He hasn't violated anything. He hasn't performed the mitzvah, the positive commandment, but he's not in violation. However, if, let's say the Shema, a Jew has an obligation to say the Shema, which we're going to discuss twice a day. That's incumbent on every male Jew. If you don't say the Shema, you're in violation of not performing a positive commandment that you're obligated to perform. If you wear a four-cornered garment and you don't put the fringes on the corners, then you're in violation of the positive commandment. But if you choose not to put wear the four-cornered garment, you're not in violation of anything. You're only denying yourself an opportunity which has infinite worth on a spiritual level. That's what it is. So the Torah says only if you have the four-cornered garment, then you must put these strings. And of course, they're to be considered, it's not you take any string. The strings are made of a certain fiber. It's made of wool. When they're spun, it's spun with a specific intent. Just as when you write a Sefer Torah has to be written with an intent to fulfill the mitzvah of writing Sefer Torah. When you spin the strings, the thread for these strings, it must be spun with a specific intent, that it's being spun as thread for tzitzis. In addition, besides thread, tzitzis is usually, minimally, it has to be 4-ply. It's a 4-ply string. It's considered more perfect if it's an 8-ply string. Tzitzis, which are of quality, halachic standard, the string is an 8-ply string. It's called kafu shmona. It's 8-ply, and that's what it is. But not only when you spin the thread, it must be spun with this intent. Even when you twist it, when you take 8 of these strings and you twist them into one string, creating this 8-ply thread or the 4-ply thread, it also must be twisted into one for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis. If it's not, it doesn't qualify, although it looks exactly as it is, it's not valid. Now, who's qualified to actually spin the thread or twist the multiple strings into one string, threads into one string? Firstly, you have to be a Jew. If a non-Jew does it, it has no value whatsoever. It has to be a Jew. One who has an obligation to wear tzitzis. A non-Jew has no obligation to wear tzitzis. It's like if a non-Jew could be the best calligrapher in the world, if he writes a Sefer Torah, it has no value whatsoever. If he writes tefillin, the parchment has no value whatsoever. Although he intends to do it for the mitzvah of tefillin, doesn't make a difference. Only the one who's obligated to wear tefillin is qualified to wear tefillin. Mezuzah. What about a mezuzah? A non-Jew writes a mezuzah, it's not a valid mezuzah, even though it meets all the criteria. If the words are there, they're shaped properly, the parchment is the right parchment, it's not a valid mezuzah. It has to be written by a Jew. If it's written by a minor, it's not valid. Even a Jew, he's a minor, because a minor has no obligation to wear tefillin. If he doesn't wear tefillin, he's not qualified to write the tefillin. Even though he writes it, he has greater understanding of its value, but he doesn't qualify. He must be an adult. What about a woman? A woman has no obligation to wear tefillin. Is she qualified to write tefillin? The answer is no. Because only the one who has an obligation to wear tefillin is qualified to write tefillin. What about mezuzah? If a woman to write a mezuzah, a woman is obligated to put a mezuzah on her doorpost as a man. There's no difference in a man and a woman. It's not valid. Why? Because the Torah, at the end of the first paragraph of the Shema, it juxtaposes the mitzvah of tefillin to the mitzvah of mezuzah, putting mezuzah on your doorpost. So the Talmud tells us the one who was obligated to wear tefillin, only that person is qualified to write the mezuzah. The woman who has no obligation to wear tefillin, she's not qualified to write the mezuzah. There was a story many years ago, it's known that Yemenite Jews, they're very artistic in calligraphy and in very delicate work in silver and gold. They have tremendous ability. And the Yemenites, when they came from Yemen, they were literally living in abject poverty. And everybody wants, everything is cost. If you're able to sell it for less, there's a greater clientele to buy it. So they went, there was a certain person who was a manufacturer of mezuzah, and has to be handwritten. He went and commissioned Yemenite women to write the mezuzahs. Nobody knew this. And they thought they were buying mezuzahs, and had even had the certification of the Rabbanut, the chief rabbinate, the rabbinate of Israel. And later they found out this man was doing something which wasn't acceptable, because the mezuzahs they sold to thousands of people, although visually speaking, it looked like something of quality, and they bought it for something below market, but they weren't kosher. So everybody had to return it. When they took a loss, that's not the issue. But again, the only person who's qualified to write the mezuzah or the Sefer Torah is only the person who's obligated to wear tefillin. If he's not obligated, whether it's the minor, the woman, or the non-Jew, it has no value whatsoever. So that's just an aside. Then the Torah tells us, and the tzitzis will be yours when you put them on the four corners. And the Torah tells us, and we say this in the Shema every day in the third paragraph, and when you will see those fringes, you will see the tzitzis. When you look at those tzitzis, you remember all the mitzvahs Hashem, all the mitzvahs of Hashem, and when you see it, you remember them to the point that you'll internalize their value, and therefore you'll actualize them. So there's a beautiful word from the Chofetz Chaim. There's a concept known as out of sight, out of mind. Out of sight, out of mind. So although a person can be knowledgeable and proficient in the whole Torah, but if you don't think about it and you're not exposed to it recently, you're not touched by it. So let's say a person feels his enthusiasm for mitzvah is waning, and he says the Shema, or even if he's not saying the Shema, he's wearing tzitzis, and he looks at the strings, and the strings on this four-corner garment were made properly with the right intent. There's something innate in the tzitzis and those strings, because it represents, as we'll discuss in a moment, Taryag mitzvos, the 630 mitzvos. When you look at them, you're touched, and immediately brings to mind to a point that you can internalize the value. And therefore the Torah says, Uschartem urisim oso. When you see them, Uschartem mitzvos Hashem, you remember them. To what degree? Asisim oso. You remember them to relate to the value, and it will cause you to actualize the mitzvah. So the Chofetz Chaim says, if a person feels, you're walking down the street, you're at home, and you feel that you are lagging in the mitzvah arena, you should look at your tzitzis. Because if you look at your tzitzis, it will touch your soul, so to say. It touches your spiritual wiring, and it activates it. which gives you that sense of value, and that will allow you to actualize more easily. That's its value. That's the Chofetz Chaim's advice. But the Chofetz Chaim says very simply, something you studied, something that you know, so you can only remember something that you forgot or that you're not in touch with. Let's say you never studied it. You realize man knows nothing. A person's a blank slate. You look at the tzitzis, all of a sudden, it's not that you have the 613 mitzvahs immediately imprinted on your mind. It's only you will remember. When you look at the tzitzis, when you look at them, it will cause you to remember. To what degree to remember? To the point where you'll be able to internalize it, and therefore you'll be able to actualize the mitzvahs. Okay, now, there's a question, and when we say, there's a question, according to some, based on the Zohar, we have 248 positive commandments. And there's a question, what are those positive commandments? Some are they an independent positive commandment? It's not a positive commandment whatsoever. And we find many arguments among the earlier commentators, the codifiers, Rambam, Maimonides, Nachmanides, and others. And there's always a question exactly how to classify the 248 positive commandments. So if there's a question, when the Torah says, and you will look at them, you will look at it, and you remember the mitzvahs of Hashem, and you will actualize them. Is that a positive commandment? It's a question. Maybe when you look at your tzitzis, when you say the Shema, and people usually do, you do look at the tzitzis. Usually you hold the tzitzis in your left hand, wrapped around your finger, and as you say, risimoso, you look at it. So is it good advice, but it's not a mitzvah whatsoever? Or some say, no, when you look at it, as Torah says you should look at it, if it's a fulfillment of a positive commandment. Look at the tzitzis. And then the Torah tells us, Lo sasura achrei levavchem. You're not permitted to veer after your hearts. What's the heart? What lies in the heart? What is it referring to? When we'll study the first portion of the Shema, it says, Al levavecha. Grammatically speaking, in Hebrew, heart has only one base. It should say al libcha. You should put it on your heart, libcha. The double base, the base is superfluous. It says lo sasur achrei levavchem. You should not veer after your heart with a double base. Could say libchem. What's levavchem? So the Talmud tells us, we all know we have two inclinations. Based on our physicality, that we have the negative inclination. Because due to our physicality, we're inclined to do things which are not in sync with our spirituality, that we're supposed to. Then we have a positive inclination, which has to do with the mind, with the soul, which is what we call conscience. Sometimes you have a conflict between conscience and desire. Who wins over what? Now, what is the basis for everything? Believing in God. If you don't believe in God, there's nothing to talk about. There's no spiritual arena. I mean, there's paganism, which they believe that is what it's about. But if one doesn't believe in God, we don't even begin discussing commandments, positive commandments, negative commandments. You're not bound to anything. The heart is belief. Lo sasur achrei levavchem, the double base. One base represents the heart, the feeling, the sense, the evil inclination. The evil inclination, we're talking about heresy, to assume position of heresy. Although there are many whisperings in our ear of what is and what's not, you should not pay attention. Lo sasuru. You should not veer after your heart. It's interesting. We find in this last week's reading, the Jews asked for scouts to scout out the land. We call them the Meraglim, the spies. But they want to be losur es oretz. They want to scout out the land. They want to go there and preview it, get a sense of what it is. Torah says, the heart may have many interests, but you can't go after all the interests of the heart. Because some of those interests are what? Are contradictory and the antithesis of what the Jews permitted to believe. And once you're drawn into there, you begin developing a curiosity. And as they say, one thing leads to another. It's a slippery slope. And ultimately, it could lead to what? Actually denying God's existence. Because you have these questions. No, belief is not something which is just an intellectual concept. It's something either you feel it or you don't feel it. Either you believe or you don't believe. You say, well, Jewish belief is that. And it's been proven, it's irrefutable, it's basis. But you know something? I'm not touched by it. So if you're not touched by it, it's totally irrelevant. Whether you know it, it doesn't, you don't know it, you don't believe in God. Belief is something which is a reality. You're touched, touch your heart, you feel it. My heart tells me. There's a famous story with the Chazon Ish and Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion was the first prime minister of Israel. And he himself was a tough man. He was as pompous and as arrogant. You can't imagine his level of self-centeredness and arrogance. And he thought he knew it all. And Ben Gurion did not believe in God. Did not believe in God. In the Israeli Declaration of Independence, the equivalent, it does not say God's name is not mentioned. Not mentioned. They're opposed that God's name should not be mentioned in that document, which is the founding document of the state of Israel. Okay? Ben Gurion, he was what we call a Bundist, a Yiddishist. That's what he was. But he prided himself. He knew Tanakh. He knew Tanakh very well. Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, and scripture. Even though he felt that was cultural. But that is the culture of the Jewish people, the Bible. But observance-wise, nothing whatsoever. But he felt he knows more than most people, because how many people are proficient and have it literally committed to memory? He had it, okay? So when the state of Israel was founded, there was a question. People are studying Torah. Do you conscript them into the army? Are they subject to the draft, to military conscription? In the United States, even till many years ago, there was a divinity exemption. It was called 4D, for divinity. If you were a divinity student, it had nothing to do with your religion, whether you were Jew, non-Jew. If you were a student of divinity, you were exempt from the draft. You weren't conscripted into the armed forces in the United States. That was the exemption, 4D. So the question was, in Israel, where there are less people and you need every able-bodied man to go to war or to protect the country, do you conscript people who are committed to Torah study? Do you have such an exemption as a divinity exemption? So the Chazon Ish was the leading Torah sage of the generation. He lived in Israel. He was a little man, was not very tall. He literally weighed less than 100 pounds, but the man was a giant. The man was a living angel. And his word was the final word. And Ben Gurion understood that regardless of what he represents, the Chazon Ish says, halachically, if people are committed to study, you have no right to draft them, because the protection of the Jewish people is our spiritual backbone. And if people are studying and committed to Torah, that will protect us. He will not allow that to be breached whatsoever. And Ben Gurion could stand on his head and spit wood nickels. It doesn't make a difference. He's not going to change the Chazon Ish. Okay? So, but Ben Gurion believed that through his power of persuasion and his ability and his understanding, he's going to out-argue the Chazon Ish. Okay? This is right when the state of Israel was founded. Bnei Brak was a bunch of sand dunes. Backward, wasn't developed whatsoever. And the Chazon Ish lived in like a 2-room house, like basically the equivalent of a little home. You want to call it a hut, small residence. One day, a black car pulls up to the Chazon Ish's house. You can see pictures in the 40s, those kinds of cars with the rounded backs. And person gets out. It's the personal secretary of Ben Gurion. And he's coming to set an appointment when Ben Gurion could come to Iraq to discuss this issue with the Chazon Ish. Knocks on the door, he comes in, and he says to him, I'd like to set a appointment for the Prime Minister of Israel, Ben Gurion. When could we set the appointment? So the Chazon Ish says to him, my door is open 24 hours a day. If any Jew is willing to come. Prime Minister, not Prime Minister, whenever he comes, I'm happy to welcome, to meet him and greet him and discuss whatever he wants to discuss. When this secretary, who himself was a secular Jew, literally also an enlightened Jew, and he himself had no patience and no tolerance to this kind of Jew. He saw this Jew as an archaic, backward Jew. So he begins seething. The brazenness, the audacity, disrespect. Here, I want to set an appointment for the Prime Minister of Israel, and he tells me every Jew is welcome to come to his house 24 hours a day. He's no different than even the most simple Jew. Could you imagine equating the Prime Minister of Israel to a simple Jew? He was seething, livid. He was about to explode. This is before, he had medication, to diffuse that tension. He gets back to Jerusalem, goes into the Ben Gurion. He tells him the story, and he sees he's about to explode. He says, what are you upset about? He tells him the story. So Ben Gurion himself says, you should be impressed. He's a Jew who's faced by nobody. That's to be impressed, not to be upset about. So he understood exactly who he's going to speak to. He's not impressed, but he felt he had the goods to deliver. He'll be able to convince him because he's an expert in the Bible, prophets, and scripture. He'll prove to him that based on scripture and text, his position is the more cogent position. And he'll convince him yeshiva students, people who are committed to Torah study, should be conscripted into the draft. Okay? Goes to Bnei Brak, gets involved in this back and forth discussion, and nobody was present. It was only the two of them by themselves. And after back and forth, they met for 2 hours. Ben Gurion saw he was getting nowhere. There was no way he was moving. And with all his so-called proofs and reasons why yes, fell on deaf ears. Not because he was obstinate, because he showed him. What you're saying is your interpretation. It's not really the correct understanding. And the Chazon Ish was proficient in the Torah in its entirety, the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, with its commentaries. This man, what does he know? He knows what the little translation of the words. More than that, he doesn't know. Chazon Ish says, but we don't move, we don't budge. And what happened was, he says, but tell me, how do you know you're right? How do you know you're right and I'm wrong? So Chazon Ish opened his shirt and he pointed to his heart. And he says, you know how and why I'm right? Because my heart tells me I'm right. Because my heart reads the script and reads the terrain correctly. My heart tells me that's the correct position, and therefore we don't budge. We don't move from that position. Lo susur achrei levavchem. Don't veer after your heart. The question is, what's contained? What orients that heart? Is that heart, its orientation, the ultimate level of spirituality, which is the word of God, the written oral law, and you dedicated a lifetime that every aspect of that emotion and intellect is fully invested in holiness, and you're connected at the highest level. So if that heart, what it feels and what it says and what it dictates, that's the word of God. What is your heart? You're a heretic. You don't believe in God. If that's the case, what you believe, it's all coming from what you want to impose, and what you feel it's right, it's irrelevant. My heart tells me it's unacceptable. We have to have a group dedicated to Torah study. And if they are, they should not be conscripted, and they will not be conscripted. Who won the argument? He won the argument only because he realized he couldn't move the Chazon Ish. So the government agreed there's going to be an exemption from the draft divinity student. The person who's committed to Torah study, they will not be drafted into the armed forces of Israel at the time. Ben Gurion, as much as he saw the Chazon Ish as a person we didn't agree with, but he never met such an impressive person in his life. Never met such a person. His breadth and depth of knowledge and his ability to debate and stand up for what he believed. Because we're talking about the man was a pompous guy, this Ben Gurion. He believed he could crush anybody like a cockroach. And they had plenty of them in Israel in those years, and lice also. So he believed it, but he didn't get an inch, not an iota. Was he able to move him? Overly impressed. So I'll tell you a story, interesting story. So he had an assistant, Ben Gurion, one of his close confidants. His wife, who was not an observant Jew at all, also a European Jew, but his wife had a slight degree of traditional behavior. She would light candles for Shabbos. That's the only thing she did. Before sundown Friday, she would light candles. Of course, she was taught by her mother that when you light candles, you pray for your children, that they should be healthy and wealthy and secure and protected. So that she did. Outside of that, she did nothing else. So when, after this confidant of Ben Gurion heard how Ben Gurion was overly impressed that he never met a human being like the Chazon Ish, he shares the story with his wife. His wife's taken aback because Ben Gurion's impressed with no one. And he's impressed with Chazon Ish, so what does she start doing? When she lights candles, she starts praying. She has no idea who the Chazon Ish is, that her children should be like the Chazon Ish. You hear the story. So there's a person who I had to do with, he came to the United States maybe 25 years ago. His name was Hyman. His last name was Hyman. And his father was this Ben Gurion's confidant. And he became a Baal Tshuva. And why did he become a Baal Tshuva? Because his grandmother prayed when she lit candles that her children should be like the Chazon Ish. I mean, it would be like, something, a room that's darker than dark. And all of a sudden, light comes from nowhere. Where is it coming from? The grandmother prayed. She had no idea who the Chazon Ish was. But she created a spark, and that spark brought about that her grandson, who was raised secularly in Israel, he was a teenager already, devoid of anything Jewish, and all of a sudden he has interest in Judaism. And he became an observant Jew. He became a Hasidic Jew. He looked more Jewish than I looked Jewish. Side locks, the works. Where did it come from? Because his grandmother prayed that she should have a grandson, her children to be like the Chazon Ish. That's the story. But again, the Chazon Ish says, how do I know I'm right? Libi Omer, my heart tells me. That's how I know. So we pray to God. There's a negative command, Lo Sasur Achrei Levavchem. You're not permitted to read heretical works which are of heresy, because you never know how you can be touched, since within the heart you have that Achilles heel, you have that level of vulnerability, because every one of us has an evil inclination, and you're open for certain whisperings, which can be very destructive and detrimental to you. Torah says you can't go there. You can't expose yourself to that. You can't expose yourself to heresy, because ultimately you never know to what degree you could be touched. Even if you're not touched, but you can't put yourself in spiritual jeopardy because of this reality that we have within our hearts, not one inclination, we have two inclinations. That's why you have the double bays. Levavachem represents the evil inclination, and because we are physical beings, and every physical being wants to be independent, not bound by anybody, as we find by Adam when he ate of the tree of knowledge. Although God said to him, don't eat of the tree of knowledge. You could have anything you want, but not that, because you tell me no, I say yes. There's a certain defiance that a person has when you're told no. That's when the person goes and defies the one who dictates to him. A person doesn't want to be dictated to. No, and that streak is in every human being. You have to be able to approach it in a way that the person you speak to is on your side. He has to appreciate why, not that you're in any way dictating, that he's lesser than you are. I always say over something interesting. In shul, and the law is The halacha dictates you're not supposed to speak during certain times during the prayer service, or during the reading of the Torah. You're not supposed to speak. And some people are very lax; they do speak. And the people who speak know you're not supposed to speak, but they speak in either case. Somebody comes over to them and says, in a very gentle way, says, "You shouldn't be speaking." The person immediately is offended. Who are you to tell me not to speak? Who are you to tell me? You're going to tell me not to speak? And right away, he touched a raw nerve in this person. And there could be a reaction. And all of a sudden, there's a tumult in that corner of the shul, of the synagogue. If anybody tells me, let the rabbi tell me not to speak, not you. You shouldn't be the one to tell me not to speak. So, and the person would say to him, but what I'm telling you, it's not what I'm saying. If you open the code of laws, what we call the Shulchan Aruch, it said, it's explicit. I'm not telling you, this is not my position. That's the position, the halachic position. Doesn't make a difference. Who are you to tell me? Okay? You have another person davening in the shul, a real tzaddik, a person everybody respects and literally reveres because he's so pure and so selflessly dedicated to the religion. And that person goes over to the same person and says, Chaim, you shouldn't speak. And he says it with love, with feeling. He says, I really appreciate what you're telling me. One guy, it's like you put your finger in his eye. A reaction you can't imagine. This other person, he says, Chaim, really, it's not in your best interest to speak. You shouldn't speak. And so, I really appreciate you came over to tell me that because I know you're interested in me. The tzaddik who's humble, and he does it not to impose his will on me. He has no ulterior motive other than me doing the right thing. You're appreciative. The other person, who's not God's gift to humanity, who do you tell me what I'm supposed to do? Are you telling me because it's for me or because you want to impose your will on me? So whenever a person feels any sense you're dictating to the other person, there's a reaction. There's a reaction. God says no, we say yes. No, let's test the waters. It creates a curiosity. Famous midrash, we find that when Avram Avinu went to Egypt because there was a famine, he had no children, and his wife Sarah, as the Talmud tells us, was one of the most beautiful women ever existed in existence. And Egypt, we're talking about the black people. And if they would see Sari Menu immediately, what would they do? They would kill Avram and take Sarah to be the wife, the future queen of Egypt. So what did he do? We find initially it says they were going to Egypt, Avram and Sarai, her name was Sarai at the time. And then when they come to Egypt, it doesn't mention Sarah is not there. Sarai is not there. Where is she? So Rashi cites the midrash. He put her in a box. He hid her because he wanted to conceal her from the eyes of the Egyptians. So he comes in. He goes through border control. You have customs. So he has this big crate. They said, but what's in the crate? Nothing important. He says, we want you to open the crate. If I don't open the crate, I'm willing to pay whatever the tariff is. I'll pay the tariff. We want you to open the crate. You could double the tariff, quadruple the tariff. I'm willing to pay. The more he would oppose, he said no, and he paid more. They knew there was something special in that crate. They opened it up, and sure enough, Sarah is in the crate. And she means she's taken without consulting with Avram, whether he wants her to be the wife of the king or not, and then everything follows. But when you say no, the person says yes. That's it. You can't go after your hearts. You can't begin reading heretical works because there is that vulnerability because we have that evil inclination with us, and there's that attentive ear that if you speak to it, it listens. And once it listens, it could draw it in. And once you're touched by it, God forbid, it's just a question of time before you can even reject God. Therefore, a Jew is not permitted to read heretical works for that reason. That's no susura achrei levavchem. You're not permitted to veer after your hearts. After your eyes. What's the eyes? A person is an art collector. So, but you understand, as much as he understands art, he needs a broker to go seek out where the art is. So he hires a person that he should go surf the web, surf the terrain to find quality art because he's interested in buying. So who's the broker of the heart? The heart craves, but you don't understand. It may crave, but if the person knows there's nothing, it can't be satisfied, it stops craving. I'll give you an example. Person's on a desert island and he has an issue with women. Can't control himself. There's no woman on this island, 1,000-mile radius of this island. You understand? You know what happens? He's interested in pineapples and some other kind of fruit. His interest, why? Because if the heart can't be satisfied, the person understands, he actually just shuts down. There's no point in living in a state of agony. But if you have a broker that could broker it and could find what you're looking for, then the heart continues to want to crave for whatever that may be. So the eyes are the broker of the heart. Don't go after your eyes, because the eyes are always looking to satisfy, to bring back the goods for what the heart is craving, the desires of the heart, whether it's women, whether it's other things. That's what it's all about. Whether it's pleasures of life, the heart is always seeking out that to push the envelope to another level. Just want to tell over a story. The Gemara tells over a story. It says there's something innate in tzitzis that, as it says, when you look at them, you remember the mitzvahs, and you'll be touched in a way, you'll internalize to the point that you will actualize the mitzvah. Asisa. There's something inherent in the tzitzis. Somebody tells of a story that this person, he heard about a certain prostitute, and he was willing to pay the fee that she should avail herself to him. So he goes, pays the fee in advance, has the address, arrives at the location, and of course he's eager, he's totally consumed with desire, and he's wearing tzitzis. And he gets into bed with her. And all of a sudden, accidentally, the tzitzis hit him in the eye. And he sees the tzitzis. The moment he sees it, he gets out of that bed, he runs for his life, and she can't understand it. She takes it personally. Here she's this world-renowned, whatever you want to call, harlot. And this man, he paid, and he's willing to forfeit what he paid. He's run the other way. So she said to him, what's going on? What happened over here? So he told him, what I was about to do is not permitted. And it's only I came to my senses when I saw the tzitzis. And this is an example of Risa Mosa. When you see it, you remember and actually be able to internalize the reality. Your soul somehow is touched. It's like if initially you see fire as a sauna that you're able to thrive, then you realize you go into that sauna, you don't come out alive. When you come to the realization, there's not even a consideration of going to that sauna. Identically, the tzitzis, visually seeing them, she was impressed. It turned out to be, she went and she sought him out, and she found out who he was, and ultimately she converted. This woman converted to be a Jewess, and he ended up marrying her. But it's due to the tzitzis that he was wearing the tzitzis. So we speak about a divine protection. Wearing tzitzis, although I said, you're not obligated to wear the four-cornered garment. You're not obligated. But if you wear the four-cornered garment, you must put tzitzis on it. So you bring yourself into the obligation. Now that you have the tzitzis, besides representing the 613 mitzvahs, as we'll discuss a little later, between the strings and the knots and so on and so forth, nevertheless, you have no obligation unless you're wearing the four-cornered garment. But you do wear it, it provides what we call a shmira. It provides a divine protection. And especially when you actually look at the tzitzis, you see it, you're able to internalize it to a point that it touches you, that you will actualize the mitzvahs themselves. That's what's innate in it. I always say to people, if you used to go to Times Square and you have the numbers turning, the national debt, it turns at a speed. Today, you can't even see the numbers. That's how quickly it's going. If a person puts a mezuzah on his doorpost, you're not even in touch with it, but it's on your doorpost. Every second, every nanosecond, you fulfill the positive commandment. No distraction. You buy it, it's put up correctly, and it's on your doorpost. You fulfill a positive commandment that a mezuzah is on your doorpost. You wear a four-cornered garment, which innately has the value of the 613 mitzvahs, and you wear it under your clothing. And you're not even aware you're wearing them, but you're wearing them. When you put them on to fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis. Now you wear it throughout the day. Every second you wear those tzitzis, you're fulfilling a positive commandment. And the positive commandment, its value innately is the equivalent to all 613 mitzvahs. Commandments. So what's the value of that? You buy yourself whatever the initial investment is. It's not very expensive. And you buy it. And in the morning, you take out a moment, put it on under your shirt. And now you're wearing it. During the daytime period, definitely. Because it says it's only a time when you could see them. So according to some commentators, it's only during the daytime period, when you're able to see them by natural light, not by artificial light. So why not? It's such a valuable, with such little amount of investment of time and effort, the return is phenomenal, unceasing. Quicker than that that thing spins, which is national debt, whether it's the mezuzah, whether it's the tzitzis, whatever it may be. And what does it provide? It provides this shmira, this divine protection. Those are surah achrei nechem, asher atem zonim afreim. After your eyes, as I said, women, anything of sexual nature, inappropriate or hedonistic behavior. Usually a person who's a hedonist, he's drawn in to satisfy desires. Ultimately, it's all one area. A person that his needs have to be satisfied and he indulges beyond what's normal. You understand what this man is? You check out his personal life. I'm sure he's far from whatever's, from smelling like a rose. Plenty impropriety in the sexual area also. You should not go after your eyes. Today, everything's visual. At one time, the whole concept of reality of fashion had no relevance to men. Fashion was a woman's thing. There was no such thing as men's fashion. In the 60s, they created men's fashion. Okay? One time a person had his Sunday suit, and he had his weekday clothing, which were work clothing. Unless you belong to the Kennedys or from the Roosevelts. Outside of that, you wore ordinary, very simple clothing. The Jew Shabbos, he had a special suit of clothing if he observed the Shabbos. The Gentile, he had a Sunday attire. Then he would go to his house of worship, whatever that was. Also in 60, they introduced something. Men's fashion. And men immediately, they had an interest. You could look different. You become attractive. And men's cologne. One time perfume was a woman's thing. Now all of a sudden there's a perfume for men. It's called cologne. Men's cologne. And so on and so forth. And then afterwards, if you don't have the visual, you're not that touched. Then you had advertising agencies. They were able to put it out there in a way that they wanted you to feel as if you were on the screen. And then they started printed. Not only black and white, color. Not only color, but sound. And literally that you felt that you could be that. Okay? But you realize everybody has financial limitations. All of a sudden they introduced the credit card. And one time things you wouldn't consider having relevance to what you could afford. So you go into debt. It's worth it. You convince yourself somehow it's worth paying the interest payment. And the credit card took people down that slippery slope into ruination. Not only from the financial ruination, we're talking about spiritual ruination. People went to areas and compromised their integrity, their ethics, their morals, everything under the sun, because they assumed a lifestyle which was only limited to a certain segment of the population, which was literally a very small segment. And all of a sudden, everybody, you could drive a Rolls Royce, where as long as you get somebody else to show that you have some value, and you have a certain kind of credit card, whatever may be, different reality. That's lo sesuru achrei nechem. Today, einechem. You walk into a mall. The mall, immediately, they know exactly how to play the emotion of a person and touch the senses of a person. Everything is sensual. The noise, the color, the sense. You walk in, there's a smell, there's a certain fragrance. You walk by certain stores, it's almost impossible not to turn your head. And there's a certain music coming out. And they have us coming and going, conscious, subconscious, subliminal, every level. They're stripping you thread by thread down to your soul. And that's the reality of our society. It's like pumping opium into your, like a person goes into a garage, he closes the door, puts on the ignition, and then he asphyxiates from the car. Our society, walking down the street, allowing yourself to go to certain locations, literally, we're continuously being bombarded by this kind of thing. Lo sesura achrei nechem. And we crave it, and we're looking for it. It was many years ago, there was somebody who was going to NYU, and today he's in his mid-40s, and he was going to take a course in comparative religions. A Jew is not permitted to study other religions, which are considered paganistic religions. So that person says, why not? I'm a believing Jew. I'm a committed Jew. So I explained to him why. And this goes into Lo sesura achrei levavchem. It's a negative commandment. Why? Because every human being is always looking for an escape clause. You know, the Talmud tells us that the mouse is not the thief. When the mouse steals the cheese, the mouse is not the thief. But because it has a hole that it can escape to, the hole is the thief. If it wouldn't have a hole to escape through, the mouse doesn't steal the cheese, because he only knows he has a route of escape. That's the way it works. A person we crave for many things, but we don't even realize that at a certain subconscious level, or certain whatever it is, we would like at least fantasize or have some relevance to that. Except we have an identity, we have a conscience, we can't compromise it. But what about if you have a route of escape, you have an escape clause that you're able to justify why you've rejected what you are to be something else? Everybody's looking for, on a subconscious level, we don't even realize to what degree we're looking for an escape clause. When you take those subjects and study comparative religions, although at this point you reject it and you see its falsehood, but if there's ever a time that you have to pull that rabbit out of your hat to justify a certain type of behavior or to do something, at that moment, God may not exist, because if he exists, you can't do what you're doing. So you hide behind that skirt of heresy or paganism to be able to do what you want to do. Where do we find this? There was one of the people who were part of the Tanaic group. His name was Elisha ben Avuya. Elisha ben Avuya was the teacher of Rameir. Rameir, the great Rameir, the great Torah sage, one of the greatest members of the Tanaic period, the Mishnaic period. He was his teacher. And he saw something. What did he see? A father instructs his son to go climb a ladder and take a mother bird, send it off, and take its chicks. So we're talking about two positive commandments being performed simultaneously. Honoring the father, because his father told him to do it, and also sending off the mother bird before he takes its chicks. There are only two positive commandments in Torah where the Torah tells us the reward, that if you fill the positive commandment, what the reward is. If you send away the mother bird and then take the chicks or the eggs, you will merit longevity. If you honor your father and mother, you will merit longevity, long life. Here, this young boy is actually participating in the mitzvah, honoring father, sending away the mother's bird. As he climbs to do the mitzvah, he falls to his death and he dies. So you have two positive commandments compounded, each one in its own right tells us longevity. And this child, while he's doing both of these commandments, he dies. You know what he said? If this could be, les din les dayo. There's no judgment, there's no judge, there's no God, I'm out of here. Could you imagine? This is a leading Torah sage of the Tanaic period. And he went and he says, I've had enough. I had enough. What does he do? He goes and knocks on somebody's door. Whose door did he knock on? On the local brothel. He went to a brothel. Could you imagine? And the prostitute opens the door and he says, Rabbi, what are you doing here? You're a rabbi. You're the great rabbi. It happened to be Saturday. I'm not using the word Shabbos. And he calls her out into the garden and there's a radish in the ground. And he takes the radish and pulls it out of the ground. Pulling a radish out of the ground which is grown, it's a Torah violation. It's called reaping. You're not permitted to reap. And he says, he pulls it out, he says, I am someone else. It's mistaken identity. That you say that I'm the rabbi, I'm not, I'm acher. I'm somebody else. And that was the beginning of the end. And he went and engaged with a prostitute. Could you imagine? The man is a Torah trove of unbelievable, the teacher of Meir. And because he saw this event, a child falling to his death, doing these two mitzvahs, it's enough. The baby in the bathwater out the window. How do we understand it? And the Gemara asked the question. Talmud asked the question. A man who's so immersed in Torah study, how could such a thing happen? So Talmud tells us that he enjoyed reading Greek poetry, Greek plays. In Greece, it was a very erotic type of subject matter. And he used to enjoy it. He was touched by that. And the Gemara uses a term, Tino Hoya Belibo. He had this impurity in his heart. And that impurity was festering. And of course, as the great rabbi, as much as it festers, he keeps suppressing it. But now that he sees what happens, he's out of the gate. The Kentucky Derby or the Preakness, whatever you want to call it, he's there. It's not a dog show. It's thoroughbreds racing, okay? That's what's going on. Because he had an escape clause. It's something he was craving for because he read this erotic material and he wanted to satisfy that, except he couldn't. Because how does he save face? How does he live with his conscience? He just solved it. Les din v'les dayan. There's no judgment. There's no judge. I'm out of here. Because he had an escape clause. If he wouldn't have the escape clause, he would have bitten his tongue, suppressed it, and died at tzaddik. But now that he had the escape clause, he rejected it, threw it all away. If you study heretical works, you study something which has no basis for it, which is false, and it's contradictory, and it's the antithesis of what God is all about. God says, I don't want you to go near it. Because you have that inclination embedded in your emotion, and you never know when it will rear its head. And if you give it enough rope, it will hang you. It will strangulate you. It will pull you down at a level that you don't even realize it. It could hoodwink you and brings you very gently. You know, why don't you read the pamphlet? There's a lecture at the Metropolitan. There's a song. There's an opera singer. There's a this. You'll meet somebody there. Great secular thinker, this and that. And you say, what's wrong with meeting the man? Go out for a drink with him. You know, one thing leads to another. You never know where you'll end up. I'll tell you a story. I'm not going to mention the person's name. After the war was a certain person, he lost his family in Auschwitz. And this other person also lost. And they came from the same town in Europe. They even studied together in yeshiva, the two of them. And they both find themselves in Paris after the war. And there were many Jews. It was really like a refuge. Some went to the DP camps, displaced camps that were set up by the United States government and the British government. And then they came to Paris. There were thousands and thousands of Jews, survivors in Paris. Mainly, many of them were teenagers, older teenagers, younger teenagers. And they're lifelong friends. And there was a person there, I'm not sure if he was a Jew or not, but he was one of the great thinkers of secular society. And this person, both of them were geniuses, had a tremendous draw towards this person. And he had a question to himself. Should he remain in Paris and become the student of this person and become his protege in philosophy, or should he really leave and go continue his life as a Jew and pursue his Judaism and grow? So he had a discussion with his friend, this person who eventually became a great rabbi, a disseminator of Torah, and his name was Rabbi Menashe Klein, the one who became the rabbi. He was known as the Ungvar Rav. Ungvar, he came from Ungvar. It's in Transylvania, that area. So the Carpathian Mountains. And the other person says, I'm staying in Paris. I'm going to be with this person. And the man was a genius, this person, and he stayed. Eventually became a correspondent moved to Israel, wrote many books. And years later, I had a relationship with him. And I was in Israel with him for Shavuos. And we'd eaten together on Shavuos in someone's home. And we walked back together. The walk from this person's home to the King David was about a 40-minute walk. And we walked together from the home to the King David. And I had a relationship with him. And he tells me the story of right after the war. What happened? And as a result of this, he really was maximally a traditional Jew. He was a very emotional person. And he was a genius, philosophical person, wrote many books, married a woman who was Jewish, not appropriate for him. No Yiddish and Nachas, for sure not. Okay, his wife had no interest in Judaism. And he says to me, I'll tell you a story. He tells me the story. He says, I regret that I did not go with my friend Menashe Klein. I regret it. I shouldn't have stayed. And because I stayed, my life took a different turn, which ultimately I would have wanted to. That's what he shared with me on a personal level. I'll stay. I'm still connected to the past. I'm this genius. I remember all the studies. It's a slippery slope. The moment you're exposed to other ways of thinking, other approaches, and you have many escape clauses, and you want to satisfy that, that's where you're going. So we say in the Shema, there's a negative command, there's always that element, that component of negativity, or what represents the negative, the antithesis of Kedusha, which exists in every one of us. Therefore, the Torah says you can't go near it. It's taboo. Stay away from it. Because if you do, you never know where you're going to end up. And even if you don't end up there, you have no right initially to expose yourself to that type of position whatsoever.